Howdy, AP World History students. This lecture is going to actually be split into two parts. I'm going to be talking about Units 1 and 2. Unit 1 is the Global Tapestry, an overview of the world in the Middle Ages. Unit 2 covers networks of exchange and looks at some of the major trade routes and systems throughout the medieval world. In this lecture, I'm going to focus on topics 1.3 and 2.3. 1.3 is concerned with the development and maintenance of South Asian states and Southeast Asian states. I'm just going to be talking about South Asia in this lecture. And we are also going to talk about, besides the development and maintenance of states, the belief systems found in those states, the religions and cultural attitudes of South Asia and their effect on society. Mixed in with all of that will be the role of these states and their growth and prosperity as it relates to the Indian Ocean Trade Network, topic 2.3. So let's begin. In talking about the history, discovery, and exchanges of technology in the Indian Ocean Trade Network, we can relate all of this to topic 2.3, okay, explaining the causes of the growth of networks of exchange after 1200. Within the Indian Ocean Trade Network, where all these states that we're going to be looking at in these two lectures are located, the first thing I can start with you guys is that these networks were ancient, okay? The Indian Ocean Network existed prior to 1200 CE and even into the most ancient reaches of history, all right? In fact, Sumer and the Indus Valley and Egypt have all been shown to have traded items from the other regions as far back as 3000 BC, right? They are finding items in Egyptian, archaeological sites that were from India, right? From 3000 BC. In general, though, the farther back in time you go, the more local and regional the trade, and the voyages tend to be of a shorter distance. The major change is that by the time we get to the period we're talking about, 1200 to 1450, it's much more likely that these voyages of trade are trans-regional, right? That people are beginning a voyage at a port in the Middle East and winding up in China or in Indonesia, right? That people are sailing from Africa to the Spice Islands, right? That they are crossing several regions by the time we get to the Middle Ages. But that's the first thing, is that this is an ancient trade, right? This is a continuity in history. This is not a new thing developed in the Middle Ages. One of the things that first helps make it possible are Malaysian sailors and the pioneering activities that they did in the Indian Ocean. For example, they are going to pioneer some of the first long-distance voyages, and they often acted as middlemen between China and India. Malay, where these Malaysian sailors are from, is positioned in this very important geographic choke point we can look at on a later slide, known as the Strait of Malacca. There's another strait known as the Strait of Sunda, right? These kind of narrow passages in the ocean through which a lot of traffic, ocean traffic, could be funneled through. Because of that, these Malaysians were well positioned in a very kind of advantageous spot to have this key role in this Indian Ocean Trade Network and in the early work that was done to make these trade routes more effective. All right. One of the big discoveries they are credited with is an environmental understanding, right? The understanding of the monsoon winds. The Malays were probably the first sailors in the region to really understand the seasonal nature of these monsoon winds. In the Indian Ocean, the monsoons refer to these winds that blow southwest during the winter months and northeast during the spring and summer months. Because of that, Malaysians were kind of one of the more widespread peoples in this area. You can find people off the coast of Africa on the big island of Madagascar that speak Malaysian languages. You can find people as far away as the Philippines that are speaking Malaysian languages, right? The Malays were expert sailors in the Indian Ocean, and they pioneered some of that early environmental knowledge in how these winds worked, right? How to even navigate this area. The other big kind of thing and theme that runs through this unit, and that we'll talk about in other modules, is the sea travel of the Indian Ocean world is where a lot of cultural fusion and exchange is happening, right? Not even necessarily just at the ports where people are trading goods from one country to another, but as merchants and sailors are interacting with each other, there is an exchange of language and technology and religion as well that is going to be a focus of this lecture. So, for example, the traders, merchants, sailors that were interacting and exchanging so frequently and allowing for this rapid diffusion of technology and culture came from separate backgrounds. And from those backgrounds, they brought a variety of different technologies that we'll look at here to be exchanged. Starting with the Arabs, who were a key figure in the Indian Ocean world. The Arabs used ships known as dhow ships, right? That's not sort of the, sorry, got a school bell going off. That's not sort of the original name. That is a Swahili word for this type of ship. But these were generally kind of smaller ships than some of the ones we'll talk about in a moment here, that were used to transport cargo from port to port. On these dhow ships, though, they were equipped with lateen sails, all right? You actually see a dhow here, if you see that ship with its sails that I have as part of the image. Lateen sails were likely invented by Arab sailors, although there's some historians that say they were just popularized by them, that it was an older piece of technology. But the advantage to a lateen sail is its triangular shape, and that by being shaped that way and by being able to sort of turn the mast and sail at different angles to catch the wind, a very skilled kind of expert sailing crew can sail against the wind, right? If the wind is blowing into your face, you could actually sail your boat in the direction of the wind with a technique that's known as tacking, right? Which is basically kind of zigzagging diagonally and having your sails tilted in such a way that you make forward progress into a headwind, all right? So lateen sails make it much easier to travel the oceans without having to rely on the winds blowing the way that you want. That's thought to be popularized by the Arabs. The other big improvement is the astrolabe, which is a device you see in the top right. It's a kind of a form of an astrolabe. And what it allows you to do is to use the position of certain stars in the sky and the horizon on the ocean to determine your position north and south of the equator, right? It helps you find your location when you're at sea and you cannot use any landmarks or anything like that. So a big advantage, if you're able to open up this lecture as a Google slide, you can actually click on that astrolabe and it will play a short video about how that thing actually worked if you're interested in it. Some of the other big people or states that were very heavily involved in Indian Ocean trade was China, okay? And from China, we get the introduction into the Indian Ocean world of what are known as junk ships. Again, this is a kind of European butchering of a Malaysian word that I can't pronounce either. And what we end up with is junk ship, which I guess sounds like whatever the Malaysians called this ship, but isn't quite pronounced like junk, all right? Just keep that in mind. A lot of things get their names from Europeans kind of butchering the name. These were much larger than a dhow ship generally, all right? And they had multiple masts and sails on them, and we will see that China built some very, very large junks in another unit. But these ships were equipped eventually with stern rudders, which you see in the bottom right-hand photograph there. That piece of wood structure sticking off the back of the ship, that is the rudder. And that tilts to the left or the right and helps sort of change the current, the direction of the water as the ship is being propelled by its sails. And it will turn the boat, right, one direction or another. Before this, people used large steering oars off the side of the ship. And this is considered a decided advantage. The other thing that comes from China is the magnetic compass, which you see in the picture in the top left, which is basically, the kinds of compasses that we use today, although, maybe not quite as accurate. But this is an interesting piece of technology that was actually invented by the Han Dynasty, right? Maybe as early as 20 BC. But when it was originally invented, it was used for a style of magic that was popular in the ancient world known as geomancy. and it was used for fortune telling in China. It was not used for navigation until the Song Dynasty, which we'll talk about when we get to talking about East Asia. But until Song Dynasty China, which was the 10th to 13th centuries, before that time, people were using this to do magic, right? Not really using it to navigate the ocean. Now, the big idea here is that through the constant interaction and exchange that's taking place, these technologies are being exchanged as well, right? It's not just goods that are moving from port to port. It is technologies and ideas that are being exchanged as well in these encounters. Another way we can examine sort of the causes of the growth of networks of exchange is the nature of exchange networks themselves, all right? That each region of the Indian Ocean basin specialized in certain goods that were in demand in the other regions, right? That is the nature of change. Is you have something I want, I have something you want, let's make a deal, okay? So these are some of the things that each region was sort of known for, all right? In India, it was cotton fabrics, silk fabrics to a lesser degree, but they were the world supplier of cotton up until maybe the 18th century or so. High quality steel and leather works also came out of India, as well as spices like pepper and peppers, all right? From Malaysia or Indonesia, those are the modern countries, right? But from that part of Southeast Asia, these places were known as the Spice Islands to the Europeans, who were not involved in this trade at the time we're talking about. They won't arrive until the next unit, all right? But the Spice Islands, Indonesia, Malaysia, that area, is where very valuable spices like nutmeg, cloves, cinnamon, and things like that were produced. The Swahili coast is what the east coast of Africa is known as, is what the culture and language of that area is known as well. It is a kind of blending of Bantu African languages and Arabic words and phrases. From this east coast, the Swahili coast, came slaves, which we will talk about to some degree in this unit, and then a greater degree when in later units. Ivory, like the tusks of elephants, rhinos, and things like that, that could basically only be found in India and Africa. And gold were the major trade items off of the Swahili coast. And we'll talk about how that worked as well towards the end of this lecture. From China came silk and porcelain. If you ever heard of people talk about fine china, like as their dining ware, that is because China is one of the first places to produce this really high quality painted porcelain dinnerware, right? Plates and bowls and cups and stuff like that. And then from Southwest Asia, which is probably the better way to refer to the Middle East, right? It's only the middle of the East if you're Europe. Otherwise, it's the West for some people, right? So in Asia, it is the southwest part of Asia, what we call the Middle East. From there, the big products were horses that were bred to be particularly beautiful and fast. Figs and dates, right? Sort of desert agriculture products. But the big idea there is that the nature of any network of exchange is that one place has something you want, another place has something they want, and that you're willing to make a deal for it. Okay, so you have this map in your book. I won't spend too much time on it except to say that this is the Indian Ocean world we're talking about. As we refer to the Indian Ocean Trade Network, we are talking about all the places connected by the trade routes on this map, right? They are all involved in it. They are all key players in making this kind of ocean marketplace a possibility. I would draw your eye to a couple spots, though. In particular, the Strait of Malacca. If you see that phrase, that the word of that place is right over where it says Indian Ocean, and it points to the Strait of Malacca, that narrow passageway between the island of Sumatra that you see labeled and the Malay Peninsula, where the city of Malacca is, right? The Strait of Malacca is the narrow passage between that island and the peninsula, right? That a lot of ocean traffic would get funneled through. We will talk about this in the next lecture, how this is a very important spot for Southeast Asian empires, right? It's the basis of their wealth to be able to tax the trade that moved through that strait. There is another strait at the southern tip of Sumatra, between that big island of Sumatra and the smaller island below it, which is the island of Java. There's a strait in between those islands, right? Which you could go through to bypass the Strait of Malacca, right? But control of those choke points was a vital source of wealth for these Southeast Asian states we will talk about in the next lecture as they regulated the trade between India and China. Okay, so to finish up, I'm going to be looking at these topics with you, right? Topics from 1.3, how the various belief systems and practices of South and Southeast Asia affected society over time, and how and why various states of South and Southeast Asia developed and maintained their power over time. We're going to start by talking about the states one, right? Why states grew and how they maintained their power. Starting with South Asia, all right? The first thing to say is that the Gupta Empire was the last time we had sort of talked about India as we were doing our foundations unit, all right? And the Gupta Empire was a brief period of unity for the South Asian part of the continent that ended in 550 CE. And from that point on, decentralization returns to much of South Asia. Much of India's history is a lot like Europe's history. Europe was briefly united under the Roman Empire and was never able to put that puzzle back together, right? And you had a fragmented Europe of competing countries and kingdoms and city-states and so on, up to the modern day, right? Europe is not one unified place, even under the European Union. Likewise in India. Up until the very modern day, where India is unified, before that, historically, India had frequently been fragmented into a bunch of separate competing states and principalities and city-states. So let's break this down geographically and start with northern India and what they look like during the medieval period. What is going on there is that there are a bunch of kingdoms known as the Rajput kingdoms. Rajput means the sons of kings, all right? And you can see some of these kingdoms depicted in the map that you see on the screen in the bottom right here. I cannot pronounce these names, right? I do not speak Hindi, but they are places like Kalachuri, Paramaras, Gujara Pratiharas, Sindh, Kahamana, and so on, all right? And the names of these places would change and their borders would change depending on what year we're looking at, okay? Keep that in mind. But this term, Rajput, it means sons of kings and refers to this warrior caste of Hindus that ruled these North Indian kingdoms. The Rajput kingdoms gained prominence after the breakup of the Gupta Empire, as the kingdoms they carved out for themselves brought some order to the north, okay? The Rajput rulers were made up of many different clans and lineages, and fighting and warfare between them was common. This was a continuity for India. Keep that in mind, right? That this was a return to normal after the brief unity of the Gupta Empire. One of the big takeaways here is that between the 8th and 13th centuries, so that's the 700s to about the late 1200s, it was the various Rajput kingdoms that, while still fighting each other, resisted the several Muslim invasions from the northwest that we'll talk about here in a moment. One of the more wealthy and powerful of these Rajput kingdoms was the Gujara Pratiharas dynasty, or simply Gujarat. Okay, Gujarat, you see, is where the Gujara Pratiharas dynasty is located on the west coast of India, if you see the map below, or if in the one on the top there that I put up there. Located on the west coast of India, the Gujaratis prospered by trade with the Arabian world. And this is essential to kind of talking about topic 1.3, but also some of the stuff that you'll see in topic 2.3. It's important to understand the kind of feedback loop between trade and prosperity and the state, the government, that was going on here, okay? So these Rajput kingdoms, like the Gujarat, prospered by controlling and taxing the trade that passed through their ports, right? Through all the commerce and restaurants that were able to abound because of that, through the various work that needed to be done within your economy to facilitate that trade, that made these states, and a lot of the states we're going to be talking about, this goes for all of them, that made them prosperous. But the feedback loop part is that as these states became more prosperous, they were able to grow their navies and militaries and secure their borders more effectively, so that this trade could move more freely and in greater numbers without having to worry about pirates or bandits or rival countries attacking you to take advantage of that trade, right? So you have these states growing rich off of trade as part of how they are developing and maintaining their power by the wealth gained from these trade routes. But you also have these states, as they become stronger, able to exert more control over the region and make these areas safer to travel for merchants and trade people, right? So that trade as well increased, right? That is one of the causes for the growth of these trade networks over the time, is that powerful states grew up around them that could protect the transport of those goods, okay? Keep that in mind. It goes for most of the places we're talking about, even if I don't say it, okay? So the Gujaratis prospered by trade with the Arabian world, and they experienced this particular boom in trade when the Mongol armies destroyed Baghdad, an event that, again, we will talk about when we get to the Mongols. But this destruction, this utter destruction of Baghdad, disrupted for some time the land-based trade routes and sent a lot of trade to the ports of Gujarat or other parts of India because they were relatively safer. Gujarat would be conquered eventually during these Muslim invasions I've hinted at. But they would be left with some degree of independence, right? Sort of like how California or Nevada are part of the United States, right? But we also have some degree of independence to run our own affairs, something like that. This province was very wealthy once it was a part of one of these Muslim empires. And for the most part, the Muslim sultans were happy to let them continue business as usual as long as they paid their taxes, right? Its rulers would eventually and voluntarily convert to Islam. A lot of the merchants would convert to Islam. And it was, in fact, probably merchants from Gujarat that would help make Islam popular in Southeast Asia, when we talk about that in the next lecture, although they might not have been the first Muslims in the area. It was also probably Muslim merchants from Gujarat that established some of the first, what we're going to call diasporic communities of merchants there, marrying local women and establishing themselves into local communities, raising children, making friends. A diasporic community refers to a diaspora. A diaspora is when your people have been sort of scattered, when you've been moved and separated from your homeland. These diasporic communities are voluntary, right? These are merchants that went to be closer to the business deals that they were constantly making. And so you had Muslim, Indian merchants living in Southeast Asia full time, right? A community of them in certain sections of town, right? That's a diasporic community. And that is also one of the transfers that we're talking about. Not just goods from one port to another, not just technology, but also culture and people and languages and things like that. The last thing we can talk about is the Delhi Sultanate. I don't want to say too much because, again, we're going to circle back to the Delhi Sultanate in another unit. But the Delhi Sultanate, what we can say is they are descendants of the Ghaznavids, right? A Turkic Islamic empire in what is today mostly Afghanistan and Iran that would eventually capture the city of Delhi and much of northern India. They would establish an empire known as the Sultanate of Delhi and extend Muslim or Islamic culture into India. In fact, some of the buildings that you looked at in our Islamic architecture activity were built during the Delhi Sultanate. At first, the spread of Islam into India was violent, okay, and often preceded or followed by raids and the destruction of temples and holy sites. In fact, these were not even attempts to spread Islam, right? These were raids. These were Afghan raiders, right? Sorry, I'm kind of spacing here. These Ghaznavid Turkic raiders. I didn't want to say Muslim there. These are Turks, not Arabs. that are raiding. They're just trying to get loot and booty from the temples that were there, that had a lot of them. And as far as these Turkic Muslims were concerned, these were temples to false gods or demons, right? As far as the Islamic perspective is concerned, and fair game for pillaging and looting, all right? The Delhi Sultanate was a change, though. It's not a continuity. It's a change for South Asian governance in that it was the first of the very large Islamic states that would govern the area for centuries to come. Although they resisted several invasions by the Mongols, the Delhi Sultanate would eventually fall to a group known as the Mughals, who claimed to be descended from the Mongols in 1526. But that's a little bit outside of our time period. But here we have a different example, right? The Rajput kingdoms are establishing themselves in the power vacuum of the Gupta Empire, right? And they are carving out a space for themselves through conquest and combat. And then you have an example like the Gujarat, who are maintaining and growing that power over time through their involvement in this Indian Ocean trade network and developing this kind of feedback loop that makes the trade network stronger and also makes their countries wealthier and stronger as well. And then you have the example of the Delhi Sultanate that is similar in that, right? They are carving out an empire through conquest and combat and then maintaining and developing that power through taxation and things like that, but through involvement and interaction with this trade. In South Asia, you see a similar process, okay? In southern India, the one example I want to give you for 1.3 is the Vijayanagara Empire, which is prosperous from 1336 to 1646, kind of right in the middle and going into right in the middle of our period of time and into later units that we'll talk about. Vijayanagara is named after its capital city, Vijayanagara, which means the victorious city. And it actually has a very kind of interesting story as its founding. The story begins with these brothers, Harihara and Bukkareya, who were captured in northern India by a ruler of the Delhi Sultanate during the conquest there. The story is that these brothers were commanders of armies themselves, and that when their armies were defeated, they were captured and imprisoned, and that in prison, they converted to Islam, gained the blessings of the Sultan of Delhi, and were sent south as representatives of the Sultan to spread Islam and the Sultanate's rule there. Instead, they agree to do this, but instead they revealed themselves as secret Hindus, right? That they had always been Hindu, that their conversion had been false, and they began to establish a Hindu empire in southern India that would grow into the Vijayanagara Empire. This was a Hindu empire. It was ruled by a king, assisted by military-trained counselors. The empire was divided into 5 big provinces, ruled by a governor. The empire prospered off of agricultural products like cotton and leatherworking and the steel that we talked about, as well as manufactured goods. I guess that would be more like the steel and stuff, and fabrics. And exchanged and traded that stuff throughout the Indian Ocean network, like the other places we talked about, in order to get rich. The other big thing is that the Vijayanagara Empire was the main Hindu power in the south, able to resist the invasions of various Islamic sultanates from the north. They're not able to do that forever. Eventually they will fall, but for a long time they are the Hindu protector of the south, all right? However, we don't want to paint this too much as a Hindu-Muslim conflict. That is a conflict that remains today in India there is tension between Muslims and Hindus. India and Pakistan used to be one country. Today, Pakistan is mostly Islamic. Today, India is mostly Hindu, right? And those two countries are kind of the greatest of enemies today, right? So this tension remains and exists, and we will talk about it here on the following slide. But, excuse me, that being said, Muslims were also a welcome part of this empire, of the Vijayanagara Empire. As merchants and advisors, the capital city had a Muslim quarter, and the ruler even took the title of Sultan, although Sultan of the Hindus and not of Muslims. The same goes for the Sultanate of Delhi, right? There were always, the majority population was Hindu. They never converted a majority of the population. And you would find Hindu advisors and commanders and things like that in the Delhi Sultanate as well. One part of the Vijayanagara Empire was the Malabar coast, and this place also contained diasporic communities, okay? At one point, this was a collection of city-states that was sort of like a loose confederation ruled by the Zamarin, as a kind of president of this area. But they were conquered by the Vijayanagara Empire, and again, sort of left with some free autonomy. And diasporic communities were established here by Muslim and by Jewish merchants and African merchants as well, that lived full-time in the cities on the coast and facilitated trade between their home areas and India. So on this slide, we will wrap up this first part of the lecture looking at the second part of 1.3, all right? Explain how the various belief systems and practices of South and Southeast Asia affected society over time. How was religion and these cultural practices, how did they affect and change society over time? Well, the two big religions in India that we're going to be focusing on here, and I encourage you not to rely solely on this, but to reference your readings and so on for additional information. But I'm going to focus on Islam in India and Hinduism in India and the effects on society there. First thing is that as far as Islam in India goes, for the homeland of Hinduism, there could not be a more radically divergent religion to become the second big religion in the area, okay? Hinduism is on the surface very polytheistic, right? There is the idea and belief within Hinduism that there is one God with many sort of facets, right? That all the gods are just part of this one God, Brahman. But that's kind of deep into the religion, right? On the surface, it's very, very polytheistic. And Islam is very fervently monotheistic, right? That other gods are false and dangerous to believe in, and there's only one true God. Hindu temples abound with images and statues of gods. Hindu homes have shrines and statues and pictures, images dedicated to these various gods. Islam forbids such representations. We talked about this when we examined Islamic architecture, right? You're much more likely to see things like arabesque or Arabic calligraphy in Islamic holy buildings than you are to see a statue or painting or things like that. Hinduism contains a kind of spiritual hierarchy in its caste or varna system, where some people are spiritually superior to others, right? Due to their karma, they have been reincarnated into a body that is more spiritually pure, right? They are higher up that ladder of spiritual achievement. And there's a hierarchy, and there are people that are worse off spiritually than others. Within Islam, there is the idea of spiritual equality, that all believers are equal before the eyes of God. Islam is relatively sexually modest, right? They will not have things like the Kama Sutra, right? That is sort of written in India. Hindu culture could be openly erotic and sensual. Like I said, the Kama Sutra is a strong example of that. Some of these statues in Hindu temples depict people in the act of making love and are fairly graphic in what they show, right? And it shows the difference in these cultures. What one culture saw as something that you needed to be modest and kind of secretive about, and what another culture saw as an act of creation and love and something that everybody does and you don't need to hide it, right? So they are very different belief systems, and they are going to interact and have this kind of culture clash throughout the centuries. In the early days, one of the big effects are the raids and destruction that take place with the early invasions and raids by the Ghaznavids and later by the Delhi Sultanates, who again were on missions set on plunder and looting, not on conversion. But still, many people were killed, vast amounts of wealth were looted from temples that were smashed and burned to the ground, and this made a lasting impression on relations between the two religions and affected society with death and destruction and poverty in some cases. There was the introduction into society of the jizya, right? The tax, the Muslim tax on non-believers. The Delhi Sultanates were some of the first to impose the jizya on non-Muslims in India, which again is sort of like a mixed bag, right? On the one hand, it allows you to continue to practice your religion, Hinduism or whatever it was, Christianity, etc. and all your customs and traditions if you paid this tax. But that's the bad side of it, right? You got to pay this tax to do your religion. So you're kind of free to do it. You're kind of not free because you're having to pay to do it, right? And what having to pay this tax often led to were some conversions to avoid that tax. Now, that's kind of negative stuff there for a little bit, right? Negative effects on society. One of the, positive changes here is that Islamic belief in spiritual equality and the effect it has on low-caste Hindus. Most of all the conversions that happen anywhere ever are voluntary. It is very hard to get somebody to force somebody to convert to another religion, right? They might say they have, but just like those Hindu brothers that found the Vijayanagara Empire, you might secretly maintain your own traditions at home, right? And so the conversions that happen are mostly voluntary. And for low-caste Hindus, it was Islam's belief that all were equal before God that was a welcome change for the rejection and scorn that some of the untouchables or Shudra castes felt and found within their own Hindu communities. Buddhists also were some of the early followers of Islam, some of the early converts. Buddhists that were disillusioned with the greed and wealth of some of the Buddhist monasteries that had grown fabulously wealthy and were living lives very different from what the Buddha had originally taught. And so there were Buddhists that were kind of disenchanted with the beliefs that they had been following and converted to Islam. It's important to say that it was never a majority of people. The vast majority of people in India remained Hindu. But maybe 15, 20% converted to Islam. One of the continuities, one part of society that was not affected by the introduction of a new religion was gender relations, right? Islam did nothing to change relations between men and women, as both Hinduism and Islam in the medieval period secluded women to a separate social sphere. Okay, now the Bhakti movement, which is a Hindu movement, okay? The Bhakti movement was a Hindu movement. We're not talking about Islam anymore. Bhakti was a movement in Hinduism that starts around the time of the Middle Ages, around 1200, maybe a little bit earlier, and becomes popular over the next several centuries in India, and is very popular still today. Is one of the more popular ways to practice Hinduism in modern Hinduism. The movement focused on inner reflection, and especially love and devotion to a particular deity or god of the believer's choosing. Instead of the kind of priestly focus on readings of holy texts or performing temple rituals that some of the Brahmins were allowed to do, or just trying to sort of live a strict life according to your dharma or something like that, like maybe you read in the Bhagavad Gita, followers of the Bhakti movement praised and devoted themselves and loved and worshipped gods like Shiva, Vishnu, Kali, Ganesh, or any of the dozens of gods you could find within Hinduism. The Bhakti movement appealed to many, especially women and low-caste Hindus, because whether this was the original intention or not, it did not discriminate towards them, right? Low-caste Hindus, women, were offered equal hope for salvation and blessings for all, instead of the kind of older tradition of only men of the Brahmin, Kshatriya, or Vaishya castes being ready for moksha, right? Being on the verge of achieving salvation. Now it was open to anybody, right? Now the idea was within the Bhakti movement that by devoting yourself to one of these gods and loving them and praying and singing their praises and having a shrine and performing arthas or pujas for these gods, that you would be able to achieve salvation that way, right? And that it was equal and open to everybody. Again, whether that was the original intention or not, that is how this movement ends up developing. And in that sense, the Bhakti emphasis on inner reflection, on this strong love for God, on sort of like this compassionate nature of people, was very similar to Sufi Islam's belief in similar things, right? Sufism, if you remember that from reading about Islam, also expressed this desire for a strong, personal, and loving relationship with God without all the focus on details and holy books and rituals and, Did you wash your hands the right way, or whatever religions kind of prescribe for people? Because of that, what I'm getting at here is it's the followers of the Bhakti movement and Sufism that are going to do a lot to spread those religions throughout this region, right? Because it was so much easier for them to take an accommodating attitude toward other beliefs, right? Because for them, they weren't hung up on the rituals or what holy book you were reading. For Sufis in Islam and for the Bhakti followers in Hinduism, it was much more about reflecting within yourself, finding your own spiritual truth and your own personal connection with God or the gods. All right, so that concludes part 1. That's the longer of the two, okay? But I talked to you about topics 1.3, how states in South Asia developed and maintained their power over time through conquest, combat, and through trade. We talked about how those belief systems of South Asia, like Islam, like the Bhakti movement in Hinduism, affected society over time, or how some things stayed the same. We also looked at parts of the Indian Ocean trade network and how these states that developed were made prosperous by their involvement in that trade, and how they also made the trade routes themselves more prosperous and larger because of the security they were able to provide. Thank you guys. I hope you got a lot out of that, and I will talk to you again soon in this next lecture.